The billionaire walked into the airport that morning with her usual quiet confidence. She was not the kind of woman who needed to show off her wealth or power. Everyone already knew who she was. People whispered when they saw her, some pointing, some pulling out their phones to snap a picture. She had built an empire from nothing, and for many, she was a symbol of strength, success, and survival. Yet, despite her fame, she carried herself like any ordinary traveler. She smiled at the security officers, thanked the woman at the check-in counter, and carried her handbag as though it were just another day. She was flying on an international route, a long flight that would take her across the ocean. For her, flights were routine meetings, conferences, deals, and charity events often kept her moving from one part of the world to another. She had grown used to the rush of airports, the endless lines, and even the way strangers stared at her. But she also enjoyed these quiet moments of travel, the few hours where she could sit back, close her eyes, and think about her life without constant interruptions. When she walked into the first-class lounge, heads turned instantly. A few passengers whispered her name. Others simply admired her elegant dress and calm manner. She carried herself with grace, never once letting pride or arrogance show. She had built her fortune with intelligence, hard work, and resilience. And she knew better than anyone that respect could not be bought, it had to be earned. Finally, the boarding call was announced. She rose, gathered her things, and walked toward the gate. The air outside the jet bridge smelled faintly of coffee and jet fuel, the familiar scent of travel. The attendants at the gate greeted her warmly, though their smiles carried the nervous energy that came from recognizing someone powerful. She nodded politely, thanked them, and stepped onto the plane. Inside the cabin, the seats were large and luxurious, with soft leather and wide windows. The billionaire sat by the window, placing her handbag neatly on her lap. She fastened her seatbelt and looked out at the runway, her mind already slipping into a rhythm of calm. She thought of the meeting that awaited her on the other side of the ocean, the contracts she would sign, the schools her foundation would help build. For her, this was not just another business trip, was part of her mission to give back, to change lives, to prove that success could be used for good. Passengers slowly filled the first-class section, each with their own story, each carrying their own reasons for travel. Some were businessmen flipping through documents. Others were couples whispering and laughing. The cabin filled with the soft hum of conversation, the shuffle of luggage being placed in overhead bins, and the occasional crackle of the intercom. The billionaire leaned back, closed her eyes for a moment, and let the sounds wash over her. Travel had always fascinated her, the idea that one could leave one part of the world and, within hours, arrive in a completely different place, with new cultures, new faces, and new opportunities. She thought about her childhood, the days when flying was nothing more than a dream. Back then, she had stood outside airports, staring at planes in the sky, promising herself that one day she would sit in one of those seats. And now, here she was, not just traveling, but traveling in luxury, living a life she had once only imagined. As the cabin doors closed, the flight attendants began their safety checks. One of them glanced at her briefly, then quickly looked away. The billionaire noticed the shift in tone, the coldness in that glance, but she brushed it aside. She had grown used to being treated differently, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with suspicion. To her, it was simply part of the burden of being who she was, woman of power, a woman of color, a woman who had broken every barrier. The captain's voice came over the intercom, warm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard. We are preparing for departure. Please fasten your seatbelts and enjoy the flight." His words carried the usual routine, yet for the billionaire, they marked the beginning of a journey that would soon change everything. The plane began to move slowly, rolling away from the gate, the engines humming with strength. The billionaire looked out of the window as the runway stretched ahead, glistening under the afternoon sun. She always loved this moment, the seconds before takeoff, when the world seemed to hold its breath. For her, it was a reminder of her own life, the long run before flight, the struggle before success. As the plane lifted into the sky, her heart swelled with a quiet sense of pride. She had faced storms harsher than turbulence, and she had risen above every challenge. She closed her eyes, unaware that this flight, unlike all others, would test her in a way she had never imagined. In just a short time, her dignity, her strength, and her very identity would be challenged. For now, though, she sat peacefully, unaware of the storm that was about to unfold in the narrow aisles of that airplane. The billionaire had settled into her seat, adjusting her blanket and opening a small leather notebook she carried everywhere. Writing was her way of calming her mind, and she often jotted down thoughts, business ideas, or reminders for her charity work. For the first few minutes, everything seemed ordinary, even pleasant. But then, the mood inside the cabin began to shift softly at first, almost invisible, like a chill creeping under the door. The flight attendant assigned to the first class section walked past her with the usual professional smile, but there was something sharp hiding beneath it. When she offered drinks to the other passengers, her tone was cheerful, polite, and warm. But when she turned to the billionaire, her voice became flat, mechanical. "What do you want to drink?" she asked, not even bothering to say ma'am or to keep the same charm she had given to the businessman in the next seat. The billionaire noticed. She always noticed. After years of building her empire, she had trained herself to read people quickly, their intentions, their attitudes, their hidden emotions. She didn't respond with anger, though. Instead, she gave a polite smile and said, "Just water, please." The attendant placed the glass down a little too hard, causing a drop to splash onto the billionaire's notebook. The woman's hand froze for a moment. She looked up, locking eyes with the attendant. There was no apology, no acknowledgement. The attendant simply turned and walked away. Passengers nearby exchanged quiet glances, some sensing the tension. The billionaire, however, stayed calm. She dabbed the water with a napkin, closed her notebook, and reminded herself that dignity was her greatest armor. She had faced worse insults in boardrooms and survived. But the uneasiness didn't end there. Over the next hour, the small acts of hostility continued. The attendant delayed her meal, serving everyone else first. When she finally brought the billionaire's tray, she placed it with a careless thud. When another passenger requested something, the attendant rushed to help with a smile. But when the billionaire asked for a simple napkin, the response was slow, almost reluctant. It was subtle enough that some might have brushed it off, but the billionaire knew what it meant. She had lived through enough moments like this to recognize the quiet sting of disrespect. For a woman who had spent her life fighting stereotypes, breaking through barriers, and demanding her place at the table, this was nothing new. Still, it hurt. She tried to focus on her notebook, but her concentration slipped. Her mind wandered back to her childhood days when people doubted she could rise above her circumstances. Back then, she had learned that sometimes the world judged not on character, but on color, on gender, on status. Those memories felt far away most days, buried under her success. But now, in this cabin, they came rushing back. The plane continued its steady journey through the skies, but the cabin grew heavy with invisible tension. The billionaire noticed. The pilot walking through first class, greeting passengers with casual friendliness. When he reached her row, however, his expression stiffened. His eyes flicked to her, then away. No smile, no acknowledgement. It was quick, but it added to the weight pressing down on her chest. She shifted in her seat, her instincts whispering that something was wrong. She was too experienced, too sharp, to ignore the signs. This was not just about a bad mood or tired. Staff had felt personal. Meanwhile, a couple sitting across the aisle whispered softly, They had seen the way the attendant acted. They exchanged nervous glances, but said nothing, afraid to draw attention. The billionaire noticed their sympathy. But she didn't ask for help. She never asked for help. As the minutes ticked by, the attendant passed again, brushing against the billionaire's arm unnecessarily, as if to assert dominance in a silent, petty way. The billionaire inhaled deeply, keeping her expression calm. But inside her patience was wearing thin. What unsettled her most was not the open rudeness, but the quiet calculation behind it. She knew people like this. People who tested boundaries, waiting to see if their target would react. People who believed they could strip dignity away piece by piece without being noticed. But she noticed. She always noticed. For now, she chose silence, saving her energy. She sat back, letting her eyes rest on the endless stretch of clouds outside the window. Yet deep down, she knew the situation was moving toward a breaking point. It was not in her nature to remain silent forever. She had learned long ago that silence could be mistaken for weakness. And weakness was something she had never allowed the world to see. Still, she told herself she would give the crew one more chance, one last chance to treat her with respect. She had no idea that the line would soon be crossed in the most shocking way possible. The storm was gathering, and soon the entire cabin would witness what happened when patience finally ran out. The cabin lights had dimmed slightly as the plane reached cruising altitude. Most passengers were settling into their seats, either opening laptops, pulling blankets over their legs, or watching movies on the small, glowing screens. The atmosphere should have been calm, quiet, and almost sleepy, but for the billionaire. The air felt thick, charged with something that refused to fade. She sat upright, her posture elegant as always, her notebook closed on the tray before her. She could sense the eyes of the attendant flicking toward her from time to time, cold and unwelcoming. It was the kind of look that was not meant to be obvious, but sharp enough to cut. The billionaire remained composed. Years of practice had taught her how to hide emotions behind a calm face. But inside, she felt a rising fire. It began with something so small, so ordinary, that many passengers might have overlooked it. She pressed the call button beside her seat. A soft chime rang, signaling that she required assistance. Minutes passed. The light above her seat glowed patiently, yet no one came. She waited longer, and still, the attendant ignored it, walking past without stopping, as if she had not seen. Finally, when the billionaire raised her hand slightly to catch her attention, the attendant stopped and asked, in a clipped tone, "Yes." The billionaire's voice remained steady, almost polite. "Could I have another glass of water, please?" The attendant didn't write anything down, didn't even nod. She simply turned and walked away. When she returned, the glass was placed down harder than necessary, the water inside rippling dangerously close to the rim. Once again, no word of acknowledgement. The billionaire's patience snapped just slightly, enough to make her lift her chin and say, "Excuse me, but is there a problem?" Her words were calm, but the entire row seemed to shift with the weight behind them. Several passengers looked up, their curiosity piqued. The attendant froze, her lips tightening. "No problem," she said sharply. "Good," the billionaire replied softly. "Because I expect to be treated the same way as every other passenger." Here, there was silence for a beat too long. The attendant's face reddened, though whether it was embarrassment or anger, no one could tell. She spun on her heel and walked quickly down the aisle. The billionaire leaned back into her seat, her pulse steady, but her mind racing. She had not raised her voice, had not created a scene, yet she could feel the balance of the cabin shifting. Something was unraveling. Not long after, the pilot himself emerged from the cockpit. He walked with the casual authority of someone used to commanding both machine and people. His presence alone made passengers straighten slightly in their seats. When he stopped beside the billionaire's row, his expression was unreadable. "I understand there's some issue," he asked, his voice deep, controlled. The billionaire looked up at him, her expression calm. "No issue," she said evenly. "I simply asked to be treated with the same courtesy given to the other passengers." The pilot's jaw tightened. "My crew is professional," he said firmly, as though defending the attendant without question. "Perhaps you misunderstood." There it was, the dismissal. The refusal to acknowledge what had happened. For a woman who had spent her life breaking down doors of power, this tone was all too familiar. It was the same tone used in boardrooms, in negotiations, in places where people thought they could silence her with authority. "I don't misunderstand." "Disrespect," she answered. Her voice was low, but it carried a sharp edge that made several passengers shift uncomfortably. The pilot frowned, his pride clearly stung. And then, in a move so sudden that it stole the breath from the cabin, he placed a firm hand on the back of her seat, leaning too close, his presence pressing in on her. "I will not have disruption on my plane," he said. It was a warning. "Kebate," passengers gasped quietly, eyes darting between the pilot and the billionaire. Some reached for their phones, uncertain if they should record. What was happening? The billionaire sat perfectly still, her eyes locked on his, her silence louder than words. And then it happened. The flight attendant, standing just behind the pilot, muttered something under her breath, something laced with contempt. In a flash of hostility, her hand brushed the billionaire's arm roughly, as if to push her back into her seat. It was not a violent blow, but it was physical, unmistakable. The billionaire's entire body went rigid. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. A strike. An insult that went far beyond words. The pilot, instead of correcting his crew, placed his hand more firmly on the seat, as if siding with her. The cabin fell into shocked silence, passengers holding their breath, their eyes wide. The billionaire did not move. She did not flinch. She sat frozen, not from fear, but from the deep weight of the moment. She had endured many battles in her life, but this open act of disrespect, witnessed by dozens, carried out in the sky where she was supposed to. Be safe was something she would never forget. Inside her, a storm gathered. Not the wild, uncontrolled storm of anger, but the quiet, deliberate storm of a woman who knew how to use her power. She said nothing. Not yet. For 2 minutes, silence reigned. The attendants avoided eye contact. The passengers whispered. The plane hummed steadily through the night sky. Unaware of the storm that had just begun inside its cabin, the billionaire folded her hands in her lap, her face unreadable. Her revenge was already taking shape, though no one could see it yet. The cabin air felt heavy, as if the plane had dipped into a storm cloud. Though outside, the sky was clear and endless. Passengers shifted in their seats, some whispering quietly. Others pretending to focus on their screens, but stealing glances at the woman in the window seat, the billionaire, whose calm silence seemed more powerful than any words. 2 minutes had passed since the shocking act. The rough brush of the attendant's hand and the pilot's threatening presence. The billionaire had not spoken, not moved, not even raised her voice. She simply sat still, her eyes fixed on the horizon outside the window. That silence, however, was not weakness. It was the kind of silence that builds pressure, that makes even the strongest opponents uneasy. The flight attendant stood a few rows away now, arms folded tightly, her face still flushed. She avoided looking in the billionaire's direction, but her body language betrayed her anger. The pilot had returned to the cockpit, his back stiff, his pride bruised. For them, the matter felt closed. For her, it had only begun. The billionaire's hands rested lightly on her lap. fingers interlaced, but her mind was anything but calm. Memories flashed moments in boardrooms where she had been doubted, interviews where reporters had tried to reduce her to stereotypes, nights when she had cried in private after smiling in public. She remembered every time someone had tried to make her feel small. Those wounds had taught her resilience, but they had also given her a steel core that no insult could break. And now, here she was, at 30,000 feet, facing the same old disrespect, dressed in a different uniform. But this time, it wasn't in an office or a press conference, it was in front of dozens of witnesses. The humiliation was public, undeniable. And that made it dangerous for those who had caused it. She finally turned her head and looked at the attendant. The look was calm, measured, and piercing. The attendant shifted nervously under her gaze, suddenly fumbling with a stack of service items, as though busying herself would erase what had just happened. But nothing could erase it. A murmur rippled through the cabin. A man in the back row whispered to his wife, "Did you see that? Did she really just?" His voice trailed off when the billionaire's eyes flicked briefly toward him. Steady and commanding, even without words. People often said her silence carried more power than most people's speeches. The billionaire finally spoke. Her voice steady, clear, but low enough that only those near her could hear. "You don't know who you've just touched." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't anger. It was a statement of fact, spoken with the calm of someone who knew exactly what power she held. Those words hung in the air like smoke, invisible but impossible to ignore. The attendant froze, her face paling slightly. For the first time since the boarding, she looked uncertain, as though she realized she had crossed a line far deeper than she imagined. The billionaire slowly lifted her phone. It was a sleek, custom device, secure and connected to networks few others had access to. Her fingers moved deliberately, unlocking it, scrolling with ease, then pausing over a single contact. She didn't make the call yet. Not yet. Timing was everything. But the act of holding the phone was enough to send a shiver through the air. Passengers leaned closer, curious, wondering what she would do. Some of them knew her reputation. They had read articles about her empire, seen her speeches on television, heard about the influence she carried in government and business alike. And now they realized they were watching that influence ignite in real time. The silence broke suddenly when the attendant, in a burst of misplaced pride, muttered, "You think your money makes you special?" The billionaire turned her head. Slowly, her eyes narrowing. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words cut through the cabin sharper than any shout could. "No, my power does." That sentence landed like a strike of its own. The attendant's mouth opened slightly, then closed again, as though she had no response. Passengers shifted, uncomfortably sensing that something irreversible had just happened. And then came the true strike, not hers, but the memory of the one against her, replaying in the minds of every witness. The rough push, the physical contact, the humiliation. The strike wasn't just against her body, it was against her identity, her dignity, her very presence as a woman who had earned respect the hard way. She sat back in her seat, folding her phone into her hand, her face calm again. But inside, her decision had been made. She would not let this pass. Not here, not now, not ever. The cabin seemed quieter than before, every passenger waiting, holding their breath. They didn't know what she would do next, but they knew it would not be ordinary. This was not a woman who accepted disrespect quietly. The billionaire closed her eyes briefly, breathing deeply. And in that moment, her revenge began to take shape, not in noise, but in the calm precision of someone who understood that the most powerful strike was not always immediate, but inevitable. She whispered only one thing, softly. Enough for herself, but loud enough for fate to hear. 2 minutes. That's all I need." And with that, the storm within her sharpened into focus. The flight attendants didn't know it yet. The pilot didn't know it yet. Even the passengers couldn't fully understand it. But in just a short time, the balance of power in that cabin would shift completely. What had begun as their strike against her would end as her strike against them. Ruthless. Calculated, unforgettable, asterisk. The cabin clock ticked forward, though no one really noticed the minutes. Time felt stretched, as though the plane itself had been suspended in the air, not by engines, but by tension. For 2 long minutes, the billionaire did nothing. She didn't speak, didn't argue, didn't even lift her chin. She simply sat. In her seat, still and composed. Her gaze fixed on the dark horizon outside the window. It was this silence that unnerved people most. Silence, in her hands, was not emptiness, was weight, it was command. It was a pressure that made the air itself feel heavy. Passengers who had seen her struck now shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other, whispering in voices softer. Then the hum of the engines. No one wanted to disturb the moment. The attendant, who had earlier stood with folded arms, now avoided looking in her direction. She busied herself with collecting empty glasses, her movements quick and sharp, betraying her nervousness. The pilot's voice occasionally crackled faintly from the cockpit. Routine updates. Yet there was an edge there to a stiffness that revealed he had not forgotten the exchange. And through it all, the billionaire remained perfectly still. Inside her, however, her thoughts were racing. She was not a woman who acted without calculation. Every major decision in her life had been made with careful strategy, and this would be no different. She had already decided that she would not scream. She would not cause chaos. She would not be the one who looked out of control. Instead, she would hold her silence until it became unbearable for those who had wronged her. She knew the psychology of power. Sometimes the most terrifying force is the one that waits. The passengers felt it too. A woman across the aisle shifted, nervously whispering to her husband, "She's not going to let this go." The man nodded silently. He had seen powerful people before. He had never seen anyone carry power the way this billionaire did, quiet, poised, and terrifyingly patient. One young man, a student traveling home, held his phone in his lap, recording discreetly. He had captured the earlier confrontation, and now he kept filming, sensing history unfolding in front of him. His camera trembled slightly, not from turbulence, but from the weight of what he was witnessing. The billionaire finally moved slowly, deliberately. She reached for her handbag and pulled out her phone again. She held it lightly, her fingers tracing its smooth edges. She didn't dial yet. Instead, she placed it on the tray in front of her, letting it sit there like a symbol. Like a sword waiting in its sheath. Her silence became louder. Every second that passed seemed to say, "I will strike when I am ready." The attendant glanced toward her again, caught sight of the phone, and quickly looked away. Her earlier arrogance had thinned into something else, worry, maybe even fear. She knew she had gone too far. But she also didn't know how far the billionaire's reach extended. The billionaire's silence was not only for herself. It was for the passengers too. She wanted them to feel the weight of what had happened, to realize they had all been witnesses, and that their silence would also be remembered. And indeed, the passengers did feel it. A man near the back swallowed hard, muttering under his breath, "This is bigger than just a flight." The engines roared softly, steady as always, but in the cabin, every sound seemed amplified to the clink of a glass. The shuffle of shoes on carpet, the nervous cough of someone who couldn't bear the quiet. Then, almost imperceptibly, the billionaire closed her eyes. She inhaled slowly, held the breath, and exhaled with deliberate calm. It was the kind of gesture people did in meditation, in preparation, in control. She looked serene, but everyone watching sensed the truth. She was not calming herself down. She was centering herself for what came next. 2 minutes. Just 2 minutes of silence. And yet, by the end of it, the balance of power in the cabin had shifted completely. The pilot might have been in charge of the aircraft. The attendant might have thought she controlled the service, but everyone watching now knew this woman controlled the atmosphere. The silence belonged to her. The fear belonged to her. The next move belonged to her. When the 2 minutes ended, she opened her eyes again. They were sharp, steady, unblinking. She reached for her phone, not in anger, not in haste, but with the cool certainty of someone who knew exactly what string to pull, exactly which domino to tip. Her silence had spoken volumes. Now, it was time for action. The billionaire's fingers rested lightly on her phone, but it wasn't the device itself that drew everyone's attention, it was the way she touched it. She held it as if it were more than a tool, as if it were a weapon, a key, or a switch that could change the entire course of the flight. And in truth, that was exactly what it was. For long moments, she had been silent, letting her composure wrap around her like armor. But now her eyes opened with clarity, and her body language shifted. She was no longer simply enduring the insult. She was preparing to respond. Passengers who had been watching from the corner of their eyes now leaned forward slightly, sensing that something was about to happen. The plane was steady, gliding through smooth skies, but inside, the air felt electric. The billionaire unlocked her phone with a slow swipe, her movements deliberate, each action unfolding as though choreographed. The attendant, standing a few rows away, stiffened visibly when she saw it. She tried to pretend she wasn't watching, fussing with a tray, but her eyes betrayed her. She was watching. Everyone was. The billionaire scrolled through her contacts, her expression unreadable. Her thumb hovered over one particular name, and then, with the calmest gesture imaginable, she tapped it. The line connected instantly. Not a dial tone, not a wait immediate. That, more than anything, told the passengers who she truly was. People like her didn't wait on calls. The world waited on her. Her voice was low, but in the quiet cabin, it carried. Yes, it's me. I need something handled immediately. A hush fell. The attendant froze, a tray trembling in her hands. Even the passengers who had been pretending not to watch now turned openly. Curiosity overcoming politeness, she continued, her tone steady, commanding, almost casual in its authority. We are in the air. I will send details when we land. But I want people ready before I step off this plane. Understand? A pause. The faintest sound of a voice on the other end. Then she nodded once and said, Good. Make sure it's public. She ended the call and placed the phone back on her tray as though nothing significant had happened. But everyone who had heard her voice knew that something monumental had been set in motion. The attendant's face was pale now. She clutched the tray tighter, suddenly uncertain of her place in the cabin. The arrogance that had fueled her earlier actions had vanished, replaced by the creeping fear of consequences she could not control. The billionaire lifted her glass of water, took a slow sip, and placed it back down with elegance. To the untrained eye, she looked calm, almost serene. But to those watching, she looked dangerous. The man across the aisle whispered. She just pulled the trigger without raising her hand. His wife nodded, her eyes wide. 2 rows back, the student still filming felt his hands shake. He didn't know what he was capturing, but he knew it was history. He had watched confrontations before arguments, even fights, but he had never seen someone wield silence and power with such precision. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom again, his tone professional but tight. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be cruising for the next few hours. Please relax and enjoy your flight. Relax. The word sounded almost laughable in that cabin. No one was relaxed. Not after what they had seen. The billionaire leaned back in, her seat folding her hands calmly over her lap. She didn't need to say a word anymore. Everyone knew when that plane touched the ground, the world outside would already be waiting. Cameras, reporters, lawyers, perhaps even government officials. And it would not be the pilot or the attendant who controlled the story, it would be her. This was the turning point. The moment the insult shifted into consequence. The moment their strike against her transformed into her strike against them. The cabin, once heavy with tension, now vibrated with anticipation. Passengers exchanged looks, silently agreeing that they were witnesses to something much bigger than a simple in-flight dispute. The billionaire closed her eyes briefly. Not out of weariness, but in focus. Her revenge had already begun, not in anger, not in violence, but in influence, in reach. In the unshakable truth that power in the right hands could move faster than any storm. For the crew, the silence had been unsettling. For the passengers, it had been suspenseful. But for her, these last 2 minutes had been a countdown. And now, the clock had struck 0. The turning point had come. And nothing, not even the endless sky around them, could stop what was about to unfold when wheels touched ground. The hours that followed were strangely calm. But it was the kind of calm that hides thunder behind clouds. The billionaire didn't speak much, didn't glance at the crew, didn't even seem to acknowledge the tension. She read from her notebook, sipped water, and occasionally stared out the window at the endless stretch of sky. But beneath that composed exterior, her plan was moving like clockwork. The flight attendant grew restless. She had expected the incident to pass quickly, to be forgotten after a few hours in the air. But the billionaire's silence gnawed at her. Every time she glanced toward the passenger in the window seat, her chest tightened. The earlier arrogance in her eyes was gone, replaced by an unsettled fear of what awaited at the other end of this journey. The pilot, too, felt it. From inside the cockpit, he checked updates with the ground staff, his jaw tight. He told himself he had been right to defend his crew, but a voice deep inside whispered otherwise. He knew the woman he had dismissed was not ordinary. Dean. He knew. Her name carried weight. He knew, in the world beyond this aircraft. People listened when she spoke. As the plane began its descent hours later, the cabin buzzed with nervous energy. Passengers adjusted their seatbelts, but their minds were far from the landing. They were thinking of what they had witnessed, what they would tell friends and family, what the headlines might say. The young man with the phone checked his recording. Again, his hands sweating with the knowledge that he held something explosive, something the internet would devour. The billionaire closed her notebook and slipped her phone into her handbag. She didn't look nervous. She didn't look excited. She looked inevitable. The plane touched down smoothly, the tires meeting the runway with a dull thud. Applause broke out from a few passengers. It always did, but this time it was scattered. Hesitant, quickly fading as everyone remembered the tension. The engine slowed, the aircraft rolled toward the gate, and a new kind of silence filled the cabin. When the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers did not leap up as usual. They stayed in their seats, waiting, watching, knowing instinctively that the real story was about to begin, and then it came. Through the windows, flashing lights appeared, first cameras, news crews, men and women with microphones. Their faces, lit by the glow of vehicles waiting on the tarmac. Airport officials stood in neat lines, security officers positioned near the jet bridge. The sight was unmistakable. This was not routine. This was an ambush of justice. The attendant froze, her hands clutching the back of a seat. What? What is this? She whispered to herself, her voice trembling. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, forced calm, cracking under pressure. Ladies and gentlemen, Please remain seated until we arrive at the gate." But no one believed his calm anymore. The door opened, and with it, chaos rushed in. Reporters surged forward, microphones raised. Cameras clicked wildly. Security stepped onto the plane, their eyes sweeping the cabin, their movements sharp and rehearsed. One officer walked directly to the billionaire, nodded respectfully, and said, "Ma'am, your team is waiting." The billionaire stood slowly, adjusting her coat, her movements graceful, deliberate. She picked up her handbag and turned toward the aisle. Passengers shifted aside instinctively, giving her room, some even lowering their eyes as though she were royalty passing through. As she stepped forward, flashes of cameras filled the cabin. Voices shouted questions. "Is it true you were assaulted by the crew? How do you plan to respond? Will you press charges?" The billionaire didn't stop, didn't answer, but her silence was louder than any statement. She simply walked, her heels clicking softly on the narrow aisle, her chin lifted, her eyes unshaken. Behind her, the crew stood frozen. The attendant's face had gone pale, her hands trembling, her lips moving as if forming words she couldn't say. The pilot clenched his fists, staring at the floor, knowing this was the end of his authority. Whatever power he had held in the air had evaporated the moment they touched the ground. And outside, waiting like wolves, the storm had already formed. News vans, live broadcasts, hashtags flashing across screens, activists calling for justice. Business networks buzzing with the scandal of a billionaire humiliated in the skies. Her influence had moved faster than the plane itself, weaving through phones, satellites, and media channels while she sat in silence. Her revenge was not a scream, not a fight, not a burst of anger. It was a spectacle, a reckoning, a story the world would not ignore. The attendant and the pilot had struck her once, but she had struck back in a way far more powerful. She had turned their arrogance into headlines, their disrespect into disgrace, and as she walked down the jet bridge with cameras flashing and reporters calling her name, she knew this was only the beginning. Courtrooms would follow. Statements would follow, careers would crumble, and the world would watch her rise higher than ever, her dignity intact, her enemies undone. Her revenge was not only ruthless, it was perfect. The story of that flight did not end when the billionaire stepped off the aircraft. In many ways, it only began there. The flashing cameras, the storm of reporters, the sharp click of heels against the airport floor, those were just the first. Echoes of something that would spread far wider than anyone on that plane could have imagined. Within hours, the news had broken across every major network. Clips from passengers who had filmed the confrontation flooded social media, spreading faster than the flight itself had traveled. The video of the flight attendant brushing against the billionaire, the cold tone of the pilot, and the billionaire's calm silence in response to these images circled the globe. Millions watched, shared, and commented. Hashtags trended in every country, people debated endlessly online. Some expressed outrage. How could this happen to a woman of such stature? Others asked an even deeper question. If this could happen to her, what happens to those without her power? The incident became more than a scandal, it became a mirror, forcing society to look at the hidden injustices carried quietly in everyday spaces. Even in the skies, airlines scrambled into damage control. Press statements were issued, polished words about ongoing investigations and commitment to equality. But words did little to quiet the uproar. Activists seized the moment, calling for stronger protections for passengers, stricter accountability for airline staff, and more transparent systems to handle abuse of power at 30,000 feet. For the flight attendant and the pilot, the fallout was swift and merciless. They were suspended within hours, their names whispered in headlines, their faces blurred but recognizable to those who knew them. Friends and colleagues avoided them. Careers that had taken years to build collapsed in days. What had been arrogance in the air turned into silence on the ground. They were not remembered for professionalism or skill. They were remembered for a single strike. A single moment of weakness that destroyed everything. And the billionaire. She did not hide. She faced cameras with the same calm she had shown on the plane. Her first public statement was measured, dignified. This is not only about me. This is about respect, about dignity, about the right of every person to be treated as human in every space they occupy. Her words cut deep. They reminded people that this was bigger than wealth, bigger than power. She could have made the story about her revenge alone, but she didn't. Instead, she turned her personal humiliation into a platform for change. Universities invited her to speak. Civil rights organizations held rallies in her name. Passengers who had been silent during the flight now came forward with testimonies, admitting they had seen everything but felt powerless to intervene. The world forgave them, because now they amplified her voice. The incident became a landmark. Case. Courtrooms filled with lawyers, journalists, and activists. Every hearing was broadcast live. Every detail was dissected. And in the end, the ruling was clear. The airline was held accountable. Policies changed. Training programs were rewritten. Flight attendants across the world sat in classrooms, hearing the story of what had happened, being taught never to repeat. But perhaps the most powerful legacy was invisible. It lived in the minds of ordinary travelers who stepped onto planes afterward. People who once felt invisible began to sit a little straighter. Passengers who might have accepted quiet disrespect began to question it. And those in uniforms, the crew. The pilots began to think twice before letting arrogance guide their hands or words. For the billionaire, it became another chapter in her story, but one she carried with pride. She had not chosen the fight, but she had chosen the outcome. Her revenge had been ruthless, yes, but it had also been just. She did not meet violence with violence. She met it with the power of influence, the sharpness of dignity, and the weight of truth. Years later, people still spoke of that flight. They spoke of the silence, the phone call, the cameras waiting at the gate. They spoke of how one woman turned a moment of insult into a movement of change, and whenever she was asked about it in interviews, she gave the same calm answer. They thought they struck me. But what they really did was strike a match. And I made sure the fire burned so brightly it lit the way for others. Her legacy was not just the billions she owned, the businesses she ran, or the charities she funded. Her true legacy was that moment when she turned humiliation into history and revenge into revolution.